In 2018, I founded a Chicago-based studio called Do It Better Design. I'm based in Chicago, and we're working specifically with early stage startups and nonprofits. And today I'm the editorial and creative director for a national marketing campaign called Think Wood that's focused on decarbonizing the built environment. So in 2019, I received a grant from AIGA Chicago to create a podcast series that was supposed to be called Designing Society. And the intention was to interview designers who work at this intersection as well, the intersection where kind of society meets design. And as I was getting ready to send out interview invitations, the pandemic hit in early 2020. And it seemed like an inappropriate time as our society was kind of on pause to engage in those conversations. So eventually the project was reworked into something that's now called Designing for 2020. And it really examines the impact of the last several years. Now we're going on year 3. So the impact of 2020 and the events that followed on the discipline of design and also the humanity of designers. And the project really takes place across 3 main parts. One is a podcast series where I interviewed 10 Chicago-based designers who work in and for community about how their practice changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second part is a graphic archive where I've documented COVID signage and the ways that our visual landscape has changed in the past few years. And the third part is a community health survey that really explores and examines the mental health of creative individuals, designers included, and how that has changed over the last few years as well.
Nicolette, if you're going through your slides, it's still on slide 1. I don't know if you're.
Oh no,
yeah.
I am going through my slides. Give me 1 second. It is advancing for me, but you can't see it.
Yeah, now you're on slide, it's 7, the why design artifacts.
But it's not showing full screen, correct?
No, we see like the Adobe panel on the right and stuff.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone has suggestions. But we might just have to go at it like this.
Yeah, that's fine.
Probably the most expedient way to go about it. Okay, so sorry about that. I will just briefly kind of click through here so you can see. Yep, this is me. I'm kind of at this intersection here. This is the mission of the project, a multimedia archival project exploring how the global pandemic and events of 2020 impacted design and designers, supported in part by AIGA. The 3 different parts of the project, the podcast series, the graphic archive, and a community survey. And all of this information lives online on the project website, which is designingfor2020.com. But today our conversation is really going to focus on 2 areas, the discipline of design and the humanity of designers. And so kind of separating those 2 things out, design being a practice that we're all engaged in, and then as designers recognizing that there's humanity and humanity in the way that we have responded to this situation and how that affects the creative practice. So we're going to explore that through design artifacts. And in understanding design artifacts, you really want to question why they're important. And the reason that they're important is because it's what we leave behind. So design artifacts are what future archaeologists and historians will examine to understand a given society and culture at any point in time. So these early prehistoric tools that you see, these flint instruments, that's one of the earliest examples of human design. So when archaeologists are tracing back where we start to see design and human-made impact on the environment, these flint instruments tend to be something that's pointed back to. And it's very interesting because the artifact itself was left behind. So they might find a flint instrument without actually finding any human bones by it, but we know that humans were there as a result of these artifacts. Another example on the screen is this fast food signage in Pompeii. So obviously Pompeii was next to a volcanic eruption. The entire city was covered in ash. And as they started excavating the city, they found what is essentially kind of like a fast food stall. And what was painted on the fast food stall are the various types of foods that you could eat there. And so essentially, both of these examples illustrate how design artifacts that are left behind are what future cultures can evaluate what was happening in a given society in a period of time. And if you are interested in that topic, there's a wonderful book called Are We Human? Notes on an Archaeology of Design. And in this book, they start with the premise that to talk about design is to talk about the state of our species. And one way to do that is through examining symbols. So reading images, this is from another great book, The Politics of Design. Reading images is a skill that has to be taught. In societies where people are confronted with a large variety of images every day, this learning happens automatically. When there are very little or no images, the ability to read images could be less. And this is really fascinating because symbols evolve over time. So what are symbols? Essentially, Merriam-Webster says that a symbol is something that stands for or suggests something else by reason of relationship, association, convention, or accidental resemblance. Symbols are often created in response to a social event and become part of our visual language over time. This is to say that their meaning is defined by their cultural context, and so only people with a knowledge of a given context will understand their meaning. Symbols can also be recontextualized over time. So for instance, the peace symbol, which we know to represent kind of movements in the 60s towards peace and the end of the Vietnam War, that's actually a symbol that came out of efforts for nuclear disarmament. And it follows this kind of actions that one would take in a flagging activity that's related to that cause. The swastika, obviously a very charged symbol, but it is actually recontextualized by the Nazis. It was historically an ancient Hindu symbol that lives in antiquity completely differently than it lives in its connotations in the 20th and 21st centuries. And even the Bluetooth symbol, that's actually the initials H and B of an ancient Viking that have been recontextualized over time to symbolize a technology tool. So in the last few years, we've had several symbols emerge in our kind of visual landscape that may not have made a lot of sense to anyone living before 2020. So for instance, a mask sign, which is now really everywhere, ubiquitous if you go out in public, that would not have made a lot of sense if you were seeing that as frequently as we are today in 2019, say, or even the image of two people distancing without any language explaining that social distancing is what's happening in this picture. You can clearly and intuitively understand because this symbol is now part of how we communicate. And even the coronavirus kind of shape and identity, that is something that would have meant nothing if you saw it, several years ago. And now in news articles or editorial imagery, that gets incorporated to talk about kind of the state of things. And it has stepped in as a symbol that did not used to exist before. So there are a variety of different public health symbols that have come out of these last few years that now have kind of a fluency in our language that they did not have before. There are also a variety of political symbols that have emerged in the last 2 years or so. So political figures like Lori Lightfoot, who's the mayor of Chicago. I don't know if anyone from Chicago is on the call, but her kind of likeness was politicized as a part of where's Lightfoot watching you? Are you at home? I think this image here is particularly interesting, specifically because it ties into Obey and Supreme and that branding. So there's many different kind of graphic cultural things that are happening within this imagery. And this individual political figure has become a symbol to a specific geographic region during a very specific time of lockdown. Similarly, in the middle, you see imagery about the racial justice protests that were happening all throughout 2020, where you have the imagery and the symbol of Lady Liberty kind of contrasted with police brutality in a really interesting kind of graphic dichotomy here. And another kind of graphic comparison is on the right-hand side, where you have a really beautiful kind of glass half empty, glass half full, a description of our political situation, which is done through the symbol of knowing kind of this cultural idiom of glass half empty, glass half full, but also the two different colors of the political party. And so these are some symbols that have also emerged out of events in the last few years. But symbols can be elevated even beyond just the loaded connotations that they begin to hold when a cultural situation is changing. And humor is a great example of that. So each of these is, a meme, more or less, that elevates various symbols, whether related to the pandemic or not. So, if 2020 was a slide, or this here is using the symbolism of a movie poster to show, to kind of poke fun at, how crazy the events of the last few years are. Or even going back to the mask symbolism, looking down in the left-hand corner, summer of 2020, here this woman has kind of a sunscreen or a sunburn around her mask area, which tries, essentially to connect humor between all of these different things that have changed in our environment. I particularly like this one of the dog working from home, which is something we've all come to participate in. And so actually, before I wrap that up, all of that to say that, there are symbols that are charged with meaning that become part of our visual landscape. And when historians and archaeologists look back at a particular society in a particular time, these symbols are what they start with in terms of understanding kind of what that experience was like for the people that were living then. And one of the things I question is, how will the future, looking at these symbols that have come out of this particular pandemic, there may be more pandemics in the future, how will these be evaluated, especially in a time when there's such a proliferation of media across channels over time? And another way that symbols get used in our visual landscape is through signs and signage. So since caves were first painted, graphic design has quickly and concisely conveyed life-saving information. This animal is good to eat. This animal will eat you. The skill of imparting information is to be precise in what you convey and to be visually arresting. Not the cluttered, not the jumbled, and not the purely decorative. So when you get down to it, what really are signs? Signs can tell you how to navigate the public space. Signs can tell you which areas are safe and unsafe, and areas where you just are and are not allowed to go. And again, signs are very culturally contextual, culturally specific. And if you were living in a pre-fallout shelter era, you might not understand the symbol that's presented here. And you might not understand that symbol in context on a placard on a building, letting you know that that building is someplace you can take shelter in the event of an air raid. So signs are essentially a platform for symbols to engage in public discourse. And this is a variety of various signs that have come out of the last few years that really identify a changing environment. So everything from, Black Lives Matter protest signs to signs about the national coin shortage and not being able to take cash because it's no longer something that is acceptable simply from a kind of proliferation of germs perspective. Signs about being short-staffed, signs about, kind of trying to find common ground around issues like taking care of the environment. And of course, the ubiquitous signage about COVID testing and all that comes with that. But nowhere has there been more impact, particularly related to signage, than in the area of mask wearing. So when the pandemic first started, many business owners were, I'm talking specifically small business owners, in response to mask guidance, were kind of left to their own devices to create signage that identified how they wanted their patrons and customers to act in their space. So, you know, what I think is interesting about this first example is it doesn't give the directive of wear your mask, which is very different than a public health poster, which will say kind of mask up. It's saying cover your face as kind of an encouragement message. The middle one, where is your face mask? Leading with a question as opposed to that directive. That seems to be more appropriate coming from a public entity. And this one of Dolly Parton, which is amazing because it's chic and mandatory. So business owners are also finding a way to have humor and have their personalities come through in this mandatory signage that's now required. But beyond just kind of making your own signs out of pen and paper, mask signage has been, you know, integrated fully into the realm of graphic design. And so beyond just DIY signage that's emerged from business owners, we have branded signage. So whether in the example of this mask policy here, this is a local coffee shop, they've kind of taken in the visual cue, the visual symbol of the mask, and created a policy that's in their own branding. So whether it's a local business, or in the middle example, the city of Chicago, or in the far example, University of Illinois at Chicago. So whether you're a business, a city, or an institution, this new visual language has had to be incorporated into your brand standards. This new iconography has had to be incorporated into how your organization talks about safety in the public space. And that's no easy feat, right? So if you look at the example on the right of the University of Illinois at Chicago, this iconographic language likely had to be developed just for this type of messaging. And then that would get proliferated across a variety of different surfaces or, you know, areas for engagement across their campus. As the mask wearing situation has evolved, the messages on mask mandates are oftentimes unclear and conflicting. And in the same way that symbols reflect the cultural context of their given society, signs as well kind of reflect the known information in a public space at a given time. So these images were actually captured within a 2-week span of each other. And you can see that on the far left, you have face masks are required, and then they're optional, and then they're encouraged, but for non-vaccinated customers. So you're getting a lot of different messages in the public space, depending on who's presenting this information and what type of business it is, et cetera. Which is to say that signs themselves do not hold information that is empirically true. It is information that's being kind of reflected from a particular organization and the messaging that they are sharing. And I think actually before I wrap that up, the reason that signs are important is because now they live both in a physical and a digital space. There's almost nowhere that you can go right now in the built environment that doesn't have some sort of COVID regulation. And the signage obviously doesn't, it's not limited to just mask wearing. There's signage around vaccination, there's signage around all the various elements that are now controlled in the public space in the same way that before 9/11, there weren't, you know, barriers and pillars outside of big high rises to prevent cars from pulling up, or, you know, the entire TSA experience and all the signage that comes along with that. So it remains to be seen how long this mask wearing signage will continue to remain in our environments and what the messages will evolve to be. But it's quite fascinating to look back even over a 2-year span and see the various types of information that have been shared and how those messages have changed. And the third part, so the previous 2 sections really focused on how graphic design interacts with and shapes our virtual, or our visual environment. But there are people behind these designs, and those people are designers themselves, and their experience as creatives during this time is necessary to understand how this environment is shifting and changing. So I love this quote from the filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard. Sometimes reality is too complex, stories give it form. And so when I went and sought through this project, Designing for 2020, to understand how individuals were experiencing, specifically creative individuals were experiencing the events of the last few years, stories are an excellent way to record what that experience has been like, especially for posterity. As I began this project, I was really inspired by something called the Oral History Archive of the Fresh Kills landfill. So there is an anthropologist, a historian and anthropologist named Robin Nagel, who's the anthropologist in residence at the New York City Department of Sanitation. And years ago, about 10 years ago, she created something called the Oral History Archive of the Fresh Kills landfill, where as the landfill was shutting down, she went and interviewed people that had engaged with it for a very long period of time, if only just to capture their stories. Because as the landfill was closing, which was the impetus for this project, she realized that after this had been done, all of those experiences were essentially going to be wiped out of history. And so the practice of recording a major social event through the practice of an archive, essentially, is one way to ensure that we don't forget where we have been or how these experiences have changed us. So the Designing For project that I've been working on, I interviewed 10 different designers in 45-minute podcast episodes each, and each of them practice a different field of design that intersects with community. So Lyndon Valicenti, she's a systems designer. I interviewed community designers, urban designers, a variety of different designers who just engage with the public space about how their practice has changed in the last year or so. I'm actually going to hop over to a different screen to play a couple short recordings of these interviews. So you can't see both screens at once, but essentially this first interview is really focusing on the evolution of design tools that have kind of come out of this experience of the last 2 years and working remotely. In these kind of like interstate collaborations, are you using any particular kind of collaborative tools or technologies that have really facilitated that type of work?
Yeah, so at the state level, so I love Miro. I love Miro so much. At the state level, we're not able to use it because, you know, there's like rules and regulations and sort of approvals about the types of like technology apps and software you use. But I love Miro so much. But we do have WebEx Whiteboard, which, you know, it's not as fancy, it's not as great as Miro, but it does a lot of good things. So we have been able to do some design sessions through WebEx. I think it's WebEx Teams or WebEx Whiteboard. So that's been, and you know, you get some of the similar functionality. So that's something that we've been using. I mean, I think there was one time where, like early on, we didn't have that app, and I needed to do a design session like virtually, and I was like, okay, I can't use Miro or Mural. How am I going to do this? And so I just made because we use Office 365. I just took like a few PowerPoint pages and then just made some like templates and frameworks, and then just put like some squares, multiple colors on each one, and then just made the document shareable on Microsoft OneDrive, and then had everyone like go into it during the session. And then I shared my screen, and I was able to, it was a little like jerky because of, you know, everyone's like different like web levels of web access, which is another thing, right? And you're talking about like workspaces and being accommodating of people's circumstances. But it worked. So, and it took me a little longer to sort of set that up, but I think it taught me, again, that, you know, you can be creative and really sort of punch through some situations if you're sort of on the wire and it's kind of like, oh my gosh, I don't know how we're going to figure this out. So, and that was a surprising thing for me, like, okay, we did that, cool. So, but it is nice actually having like a real tool to like do this now.
So what I love about that clip from Alvin, he was the chief people officer. He's since moved on, but he was the chief people officer at the Illinois Department of Human Services. And he was tasked with figuring out how to support all of the state's remote workers and trying to understand what design tools they needed at home in order to redesign spaces where people might apply for public benefits, where people might approach for government paperwork, et cetera. And so in this completely remote environment, Alvin is encountering and interacting with remote tools like, he mentions Miro that we may not have used in the past. And in terms of documenting a moment in time where something like Zoom as a tool has now become ubiquitous, there was a time when it wasn't, and Zoom wasn't part of our vocabulary, and it wasn't something that everyone, including my grandmother, knew how to operate. And so I believe that these types of stories are really important to capture because they pinpoint that moment in time when there was a cultural shift and there was a change in the way that creative people did their work. The next snippet that we're going to listen to, and I'm going to attempt full screen, so someone let me know if it doesn't work. But the next snippet that we're going to hear is from Lyndon Valicenti, and she's talking about how these new tools have created an impact in power dynamics and the way that she's conducting business and running facilitated meetings with various stakeholders. Can anyone just let me know if you're able to see the full screen? Is this working?
See it.
Okay, perfect, fantastic, okay.
My favorite things about switching to the Zoom or the video conference has been the very subtle shift in power dynamics of a meeting.
Yeah, talk about that.
So I've been working as a civic innovation coach, teaming up with US mayors around the country as they are trying to drive progress on pressing issues in the midst of crisis. And I'm working, leading workshops with mayors' offices around the country. And when we're all little boxes on Zoom or a video conference, sorry, I'm defaulting to Zoom because that is my platform. You cannot tell, or as a facilitator, I cannot tell who has the who typically or traditionally has the power in the room.
Oh, that's incredible. Yep.
Whereas if we were actually in a room, you could tell the person who arrives late and gets the head of the table, right?
Yeah.
In this way, I kind of have a sense of their roles at the city and where they sit in the hierarchical structure, but there is a real equalizing force of the video conference that allows me as a facilitator to not acknowledge the power dynamic, or not necessarily not acknowledge, but design around it.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Make everyone participating feel like they have equal voice in the topics.
Oh, that's amazing. I hope there's a way to continue that.
So what I like about this clip from Lyndon is it shows how these tools, which obviously are designed themselves and have come out of this experience of the pandemic, can even rewrite the hierarchical social systems that we are existing in a virtual environment. And, is that something that's going to last beyond the pandemic? Is that equalizing force something that's going to continue on if we continue to do remote work? What implications does that have for people who are working in creative spaces where collaboration is so critical? So I think that point really hits on some of the fundamental ways that these dynamics are shifting as we are kind of evolving in response to these changes. And then the last snippet that we're going to listen to is from an urban designer, Paula Aguirre. And she's really talking about mutual aid and the way that people are showing up for each other and themselves during this time.
I'd love for you to share what gives you optimism as we look forward to the future.
I feel like this year, if anything, has made super visible and demonstrated how once we're aware of things, they're inevitably harming us. We come together. And I feel like that's something that it's incredibly empowering about being humans. Of course, the other side of that is that there's so much harm, right? So how do you compensate with more, how to carve more space for love, for kindness, for generosity, for empathy? How do we carve more space for that in the personal, in the professional space, in every circle that we are able to interact with other humans? So what brings me optimism is that every time we're constantly trying that, there's more people around us that share the same values. So we find that we're an army already, we just haven't been connected. That's really beautiful to see. And just making more intentional that part of the work. How do we cultivate more values around that? Because that's the world that we want to see, and how do we inspire through the work that is rooted in those values?
I'm going to switch back to my presentation. Give me a second. All right, so I think Paula hits on a really critical part, just some background on her work during the pandemic. She's an urban designer. She used to be was trained as an architect, and specifically with a focus in urban design. And the way that she chose to operationalize those skills during the pandemic was to create networks of mutual aid across the city of Chicago. So she used her design skills to essentially create safe meeting spaces in outdoor environments where community members could come together to organize specifically food donations for the local community. And so I think what's really fascinating that came out of this interview with her was essentially how you can take the tools of design and apply them in a social context, but also how much that context really is informed by other people and the communities that designers are a part of. And I think, to show up for a community, it's absolutely something I've missed desperately in the last few years, is being a part of those communities where you're inspired and engaging with other people. And so, kind of taking moments of optimism and really thinking about what it is that keeps driving us is important so we can continue to do that critical work. And when we talk about designers, their mental health, kind of the environment in which everyone has been operating for the past 2 years is in no way normal, right? Humans are social animals. That's how we've gotten to where we are today. And so to be cut off from your social networks is really challenging. And so one of the ways that I wanted to explore that was through this community health survey. And it's a very small data set right now. And one way that anyone listening could help me expand the data set is by sharing the survey link. But from the data set that we have, I asked questions about designers' mental health, creatives' mental health, and how that has been impacted since March 2020. And it was actually very interesting. I launched this survey last summer when the project went live, and to see the differences in responses are really fascinating between even June of 2021 to something that might be more recent. But a couple of key takeaways from the data so far are that designers and self-reporting creatives have reported that 81% have experienced some sort of physical or emotional distress in the last 2 years. 73% have reported mental health concerns. And another 73% reported being very or extremely affected by the political, social, racial, economic, and environmental unrest that has occurred in the last, since March of 2020. And I think that this is critical to point out. These numbers are not wishy-washy, they're overwhelming majorities with the data so far. And it has to have an impact on how you show up to the workplace. These mental health concerns have to have an impact on how someone shows up creatively in their brains. There's as part of the survey, there is a kind of a free form response option where I ask a question about how has this impacted your creativity? And a lot of people said the same thing, which is I go through bouts of like intense, extreme creativity and then none at all, or I'm in a rut because I'm not connecting with my community and I'm not inspired by other people. And so the purpose of this survey, and especially tracking this change over time, is try to gauge and have a baseline of, okay, before there was an event, that, before this event took place, people felt one way, we're not really sure, but this event has had a significant impact, and we don't know what that looks like in the future. We don't know what the future holds, but at least we can then pinpoint to say, this event has actually impacted us a lot as people, and that impacts how we show up as creatives in the workplace as well. So just as a recap of the various parts of the project, and essentially how I'm interested in understanding this experience, the pandemic, and all the events that followed, its impact on design. I'm doing that through documenting signage, through identifying symbols, and through recording stories that have come out of this time in an archival way that anyone can access on the internet. I should also mention, beyond accessing, the graphic archive is intended to be user generated. So my hope is that eventually people can share their own imagery. I mean, I'm just out there with my camera, like obsessively taking pictures of every mask sign and then picking the best. But like, eventually I would love to see a more user generated component, because I'm only capturing my worldview. And it would be very fascinating to see others as well. So what's next for the project? I mentioned a lot of these components are already available online, but the next thing that I'm working towards is to create kind of like a zine or a small publication that summarizes some of the podcast interviews, highlights specific questions, includes some of this visual kind of this visual critique on the way that our visual language and landscape have changed, and also to reach out to thought leaders, design thought leaders, and ask them questions about how their experience has changed specifically. So as part of the Q&A, I would love to get your feedback. These are some of the thought leaders that are top of mind for me, folks that I respect their work and want to reach out to them and better understand how how this experience has changed them. And on the right are some of the questions that I would love to hear answers to. What have you lost? What have you gained? What's been the hardest change? What's inspiring you, et cetera. And so as part of the Q&A, if you have any ideas of either thought leaders that you'd like to hear from or questions that you'd like to read responses to, please share that so I can incorporate it as part of this ongoing work. And with that, that wraps up my presentation. So just thank you, and really appreciate the opportunity to share.
Cool. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I think in the thought leaders section that you shared, I think your name is missing, because I definitely consider you now a thought leader based off the presentation that you just gave. So very well done. So I guess like I have one initial question for you is, like, how have you seen, and you kind of touched on this, but how have you seen the role of a designer like shift over the past 2 years? And because I like, me personally, I feel like we've been thrown into this big like unknown territory, and it's given us the opportunity to almost like redefine ourselves and figure out how we exist within this changing world. So did you like run into like any trends or just any sort of like data that maybe communicated like a evolution of our practice?
So it's interesting. I am not directly a designer, so it's not my day-to-day work. My role is creative direction, so I'm overseeing a team who is implementing designs. I think that from anecdotal stories and just kind of through conversations with my team and others, I have many friends who are designers. I think the one thing that may have shifted, and I don't think, to be quite honest, that this is reflective of just the industry of design, but if I had to summarize, in 2020, everyone was working like crazy to hold on to their jobs because no one knew if their company was going to make it through the pandemic, which we thought would be like a year. In 2021, everyone realized that they could be just as productive, if not more so, working remotely than at the office. And so that really impacted the workload and the amount of activities and productivity that people took on. And by the end of the year, everyone was burnt out. Just universally, everyone I know was burnt out. And I think that one thing that has been reflected in my personal life is this reckoning with productivity that happened kind of at the end of 2021. And that seems to be consistent with many other people that I know, where I feel for the first time fundamentally changed by this experience. Like I actually feel like a different person than I was at the end of 2019, say, or in February of 2020. And my focus has been a lot less on productivity and work and really about finding balance and really understanding what it is that makes me happy creatively so that I can continue to show up in the ways that I need to professionally. And I can only speak from my personal experience, but I have also heard anecdotally those stories as well. And so, like I said, I don't know if it's, unique to design, kind of that trajectory and how people's relationship to work has changed. But obviously designers are constantly churning things out. I saw a great meme the other day. It was like someone handing a Happy Meal out through the McDonald's window. And on the Happy Meal bag, it just said JPEG or something like that, where it's like a design drive-through. And so I think that designers really bore the brunt of, companies needing to shift and pivot their business model. So for instance, if you were a brick and mortar store and then you had to completely shift your business to online, well, that's going to involve a web designer and a graphic designer and all manner of design support, because we're existing now in our small screen universes. And so, like I said, not that it's specific to graphic design or design as a whole. I do think that creative individuals have borne the brunt of these kind of cataclysmic shifts that have happened in the economic sphere that have made businesses need to pivot in real time multiple times over and over again. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that definitely answers my question. Does anyone else have questions on here? If you want, you could just type them in, or you could also go on unmute and ask them yourself. I have another question, but does anyone want to?
Yeah, I actually have a question. I think this is so interesting. I loved the fast food image of Pompeii. That blew my mind. One question I have, just based on the conversation we're having now, is I really identify with what you're saying about this sort of phase of burnout and reconsidering our relationship to ourselves. And I was wondering, how do you think our relationship to companies and to workplaces will change? And do you think that their engagement with us will change?
Yeah, absolutely. So the work that I do professionally, I manage a marketing campaign called ThinkWood, but it's a marketing campaign that speaks specifically to architects and developers. And so I have a really unique insight into the built environment and how commercial office spaces, for instance, are changing in response to the pandemic and what that means for the future of work. And one of the big shifts that I think we're starting to see just from, so for context, a building typically takes 2 to 7 years to get built. So if you're making modifications on how that building is going to change, that's significant. You're anticipating that change will play out and continue to be there many years down the road. And so one of the things that architects are kind of reporting back on about these shifts in response to the pandemic are kind of what's called the hoteling model, where workers kind of check in and out of their office. Most businesses are not reporting reducing their office space, but just having more distanced kind of collaborative spaces inside of the office itself. So they're not planning on having a smaller office footprint. They're just planning on having people kind of cycle in and out and be further separated from each other. Office culture and the work that goes into motivating remote teams and supporting people. So for instance, onboarding fully remote workers, I've been onboarding Since 2020, probably 12 new people who I've never met before. So that's a completely different experience than if you were to come to an office and go to a happy hour and get to meet your coworkers. And so what, again, takes us back to design is that you're creating virtual environments that have to be curated. And that curating component, that's where it falls to, someone to create the event banner to invite people to the thing, someone to create the social media post to let people know what's going on, someone to create the email newsletter content to let people know that things are coming up. And so that kind of remote technology and communication and the ways that companies are starting to support employees more, that I don't think will go away. And so that only increases the need for and reliance on design in the future.
It's so interesting. Thank you.
Does anyone
Hey,
else?
Nicolette.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Where can we find your podcast?
Yeah, the project website is called designingfor2020.com.
Great. Thank you.
And I'm going to continue to add to it. Full disclosure, total burnout, that's the real thing. And the project has been a little bit slower to implement than I had initially anticipated, but I think it's also been, I started this project, like I said, I got a grant initially. The grant covered the podcast component, but I really needed to do this work for myself as a way of processing the change that I have experienced personally. So trying to wrap my head around, I can't even go outside without a covering on my face. When I go to the store, I'm getting all these different messages, like this place is telling me to wear a mask, this place is telling me to do something else. And so my natural inclination was to just document. And it was fun prepping for this presentation because I got to go back through my archive, starting in March of 2020, all the different imagery. One of the things I chose not to include, but is really fascinating because there are so many different ways this could go, right? Like experience design, UX, UI, there's so many different facets of design that have been touched by this, by this pandemic. But one of the things I decided not to include was data viz and data visuals specifically around pandemic infection rates. And so most recently, with the Omicron surge, the use of color to just something as simple as the use of color that might determine someone's holiday plans, right? And so designers hold such incredible power to kind of create the environment in which we're living in. And I needed to document that somehow. And so that, I think, for me was kind of a big motivator for wanting to do this work, was needing to process it myself psychologically. And this became an outlet for that.
Got it. So I know we have 2 minutes left. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, but I guess one question that I have is what would you say, given all the research that you've done and everything that you've collected, what do you think is a pressing call to action for just creatives in general? Is there something that you think we should be more conscious of, or just anything that comes to mind around that?
Yeah, I think take care of yourself. I was really involved in kind of the social impact design community prior to the pandemic. Everyone seems exhausted. Everyone seems like they've been doing too much work. Everyone seems like they're just burnt out. And I think taking care of oneself and understanding that in order to do creative work, you have to kind of fill up your creative bucket, or whatever you want to call it. Personally, I'm trying to do one creative thing a week where I fill that kind of reserve of creative thinking and make space for it in my calendar and have time just set aside for new ideas and new thoughts and experiences. And so I think if there were a rallying cry, it's kind of take care of yourself. And, you can't do the best work, you can't do your best work if you don't. And then also, finding ways to be creative in environments where there's limitations on that. So, I often would find creative outlets by going to the museum I love art museums and spending a lot of time at art museums. That hasn't been as accessible to me. And so finding, creative outlet and watching music videos or, different ways of observing other people's creativity now that our environment has become more virtual. That's something that I'm trying to incorporate as well.
Got it. Nice. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Is there, I dropped the links to Designing for 2020 and your podcast and the survey. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us? Any other links, or like, how do we keep in touch? Like, if people want to follow you or just contact you, are you open to that?
Yeah, absolutely. My email, it was on the slides, so I can put it up real quick again. Please feel free to reach out. If you have imagery that you want to share, like I would love that. If you're just interested and want to chat, like please feel free to reach out. I think the only thing that I'll tease on the website that isn't officially part of the project, but there's a great playlist of like trap, hip hop, bounce music, specifically COVID related. So if that's your vibe, check it out. It's pretty funny, like Quarantine Queen and things like that. So that was another kind of fun documentation process. But in terms of reaching out, like, yeah, check out the podcast, send me an email. And if you have ideas for how to stay connected, I'd love to hear them.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for everyone for joining us tonight. It was great.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.